The first 3 weeks of the eruption here in Hawaii, crazy things would happen in the middle of the night. A new fissure would open up and it would threaten a new neighborhood. Thousands of people were evacuated from their homes. I started the Hawaii Tracker Facebook group to help people understand what's going on and get their questions answered.
Hey, how's it going? We're live. This is Fissure 20.
We had hundreds of people all throughout the neighborhoods sending in videos, articles, and images. We spend a lot of time making sure the accurate information gets out.
This is live. There's still lava moving.
They weren't just sharing a story, they were helping their neighbor. If a family was being evacuated, my group would just jump in and help out. So it was huge. They were watching out for each other.
Hello everybody, thank you for coming. Thank you for the support from everybody.
As we go through this, we're growing closer together as a community. When tragedies like this strike, you really realize how much you need each other.
Aloha everybody, I am Philip Ong, geologist, here with Mr. Dane DuPont on behalf of HawaiiTracker.com. Bringing you guys one more Kīlauea Eruption update today, March 26, 2021. Today is the 96th day of this ongoing Kīlauea Eruption. We're going to talk about the changes at the top of the volcano, which aren't a whole lot actually, but we'll still cover what we have, a lot of photographs today. We'll talk about Maunaloa a little bit. Not a whole lot of change there either, but we'll still cover the signals once again, and we'll have a special in-depth segment tonight that will be the last overflow of Halemaʻumaʻu that happened 100 years ago this week, and so that's really an amazing thing. We'll share some of Dr. Thomas Jaggar's words as he recounted and walked all over this eruption to try to bring it back to life again. It's 100 year. Caldera has now that pit of Halemaʻumaʻu hasn't overflowed ever since then. So at least a century. The last overflow in at least a century. All right, so let's get into it here. I start off with showing you guys this view of the summit of Kīlauea, Halemaʻumaʻu crater, the inner pit within it. And you can see the active lava surface is actually just receded to something around this shape. A lot smaller than our whole crater size when this whole thing was all liquid all at one time. And it's been since mid-January since that was the case. So it's been going on 3 months now that it's been closing in, forming a crest that's been encroaching towards the west, which is closest to the source. This is the west vent right here, top of the complex of it here. You can see one glowing hole, but there's a couple little spots in here. And this thing has two different sources that are both now encased in lava, so they're lava tubes per se, or little lava pathways, because it's not really a surface flow. It's kind of within the cone, hollowing out the cone perhaps in some areas, and plastering other areas to form the shape it wants to be to flow out. And so it's got two different points it's coming out of that are kind of, we're pretty close together, and essentially by this point in time seem to have merged into one strong source that's at times indistinguishable which is the one that's putting it in. And maybe that's just the way that the shape of the crust is evolving near that entry point. So we'll look at that a little bit as well. All right, you can kind of see some of these little islands, and you would see it better perhaps if I zoomed in a little more. Let's see how zoomed in we can get. That might be too zoomed in, but let's try. Sorry to drag you guys around here. West vent. Back out here.
It's like me whenever I try and use that zoom Earth. I'm trying to find Hawaii, I just get lost in the ocean.
Sometimes the zoom is not cooperative. So, all right, I will get back to it. Here we go. No. Try again, you guys. All right. Maybe it doesn't want me to zoom in anymore now. I'll just leave it at that. That we have this little island floating in here. Islet, I suppose, is what I should be calling it. After reading a lot of these old accounts, they call these islets. And another little one over here, and another little one over here. A couple small ones. And the one that we had that was heart-shaped has now fused to the rim, this upper perched rim of the lava lake. Right in there. Our main big island is over here. It's Big Cliff right over there. So this area in here used to be what I was calling the South Bay. There's one here, and there's an elevated terrace over here, and there's even another one if I pan over. Going this way, you can see it's terraced all the way up here on the back, all the way up and around to the back side, the east side of this big island that was remnants of all the tephra that formed as the eruption began through the ponded water that was hosted in this crater beforehand. So let's pan over, show you guys a little bit more of this north side. This particular photograph is obscured by a lot of fume, but there's an active lava. It's very similar to the south, parallel. The islands over here, you have some terraces and different bays coming farther up that wrap all the way back around the other side of there. So since we have some better photographs of this, we'll move on from this, but I just want to kind of point out how much this has really changed. At one point in time, we had one huge smooth lava surface that was essentially level all the way across, maybe a variation of a few meters, as wide as it was and as much as it was flowing and degassing. But essentially level, one smooth surface. And now you can see we have the hill of tephra sticking out. We have this upper lava bench. We have a lower lava bench. We have terraces along the backside. We have a lot of topography that's now being formed within Halemaʻumaʻu. That's really interesting, and it's going to be changing over time. And as we look at the historic photographs today, you really see how a lot of those features might have come to be, and how we're essentially on our way to trying to have a long-term lava lake in that fashion, right? If eruption goes on long enough. It's only been 3 months, but if it goes on long enough, it could potentially do something like that, right? Or if it erupted out of the bottom underneath this cooling lava lake, this could well become that semi-solid plug that can fill the crater and buffer those eruptions above. So interesting to note that topography now, and we'll compare it to the 100 years ago a little bit later, if you stick with us that long. All right, so let's go. This is all from USGS Hawaiian Volcano Observatory. Let's go to their photo and video chronology for March 23rd, posted March 23rd, and so there's a series of photographs here. So here we see Halemaʻumaʻu. This is now viewed from the south, so we see the west entry complex over here. that double entry is here and here. And this one, there I try to zoom in. There we go. You can see a little bit of a junction right in here, and a little bit of a split in the flow direction. Although this one may well come around this direction too. Going all around this little knob, the little peninsula that's formed now that this island has attached. And this island is very interesting as well. That's a really interesting feature we'll look at here shortly that is also reminding me of those times of last century. You can see there is a red glow. It's not that like the whole surface is red at the same time at this point anymore. I think those days are past where we have way too much buffering material in there. But you do see it breaking out and foundering, overturning. Here is at the edge of this perch pond. You see the edge of these bigger sheets also have that red tinge. Over to the right on the back side of this little islet, you see that as well. And reaching all the way around over here to the north part. And let's continue on because these all do lead to different views of what we're trying to examine in the first place. So we'll just keep going with here. So here's our double entry. It's the junction, our seam right in here. A quasi seam because really these things are really growing together. If it's just a distance of a few feet or 10 feet that's separating these things, and it's essentially merged all into one at this point in time. And the difference being the path are taking this one coming more through the ground this way, and that one comes through the ground that way up there. So that's the double entry there. Close up of the inlet. Two adjacent lava streams. Photo by Matt Patrick. All right. Next up, also Matt Patrick. A close-up on more of this foundering area of the crust. So you see that foundering area of the crust there at the edge, and in the middle coming up, a lot of this older grayer slab. That's the skin. That's on the order of a few inches thick, let's say. Based on the reports and experience, that seems a reasonable, intuitive thing if you guys are trying to imagine what it might actually look like. Right? So a few inches thick slabs of lava, and they're cracking and getting conveyored back into the liquid and replaced with fresh lava that then cools and forms a new crust on top, which starts off really thin and then it gets thicker and thicker and thicker and thicker until it eventually repeats the process. Unless something is happening below there, like for example, if it's getting shallower and suddenly you can retreat the lava and then you can start having it freeze in a solid, coherent crust. That's what we're seeing on the east side of the lava lake. So it's interesting, how much it can sustain to see the changes in that, right? From that whole area over 100 acres to now down around a 10-acre range. So that is that crustal foundering there on the west side. And you're at a levee on a southern margin formed by numerous crusts. So zooming way in there, you can see lots of these little pieces of crust, slabs of crust, slabby stuff. It seems like it's piling up and become quite a levee in here. Right? You can imagine that anywhere there's cracks, especially on the backside, the lava is squeezing in and welding those all together in some fashion. Not to say that it can't breach or it can't go underneath it or any of those things, but we haven't seen that happening yet, as much yet. Right? What we have seen is lava squeezing up from the outer rim beyond here, more in that direction over there. So that is interesting to note. How that seems to be a fairly rigid and coherent structure compared to the outer part of the crust where the lava does find another exit point without having to break anything like it would over here. Okay, so that is that southern margin. And northern margin, up here at the top of the photograph, this is the edge of the island, that big island, and all those terraces are up in that direction. So here's our current closed-in levee in that north part. Off in this direction is going to be the remains of our north vent, and you can see there's a fairly big islet over here. kind of right in the middle in the center. And it seems likely that if there's extra circulation happening in these areas over here, that this might be kind of a slower spot in the middle that perhaps is why the islet wants to be there. So interesting to speculate, and of course we'll have to wait and see track these things over time and see what they do. And that's the north margin right there. Okay, so now we're going to zoom in. I'm going to go this one all the way zoomed in too, because you can see here at the upper right of the photograph, this is our double entry right there, 1, 2, essentially merged. And here is our island, and our island has a very different look to it now. And I'm actually going to click through to the original here. And oh, that's not way too zoomed in. All right, so what you guys can see here is like a vertical texture, right? And the caption actually notes that over the last 2 weeks, this island has tilted 90 degrees into the lake. So what you're seeing is the old flow marks of when this islet this might have been the top of it, and the whole thing tipped over, fell over. So now you're seeing the side of it, and it's exposed. And it's interesting that you can kind of see different flow layers, right? It's interesting to think about how it was actually formed, in what order and what sequence, and it might be hard to tell without being able to tell which way is up exactly. I'm guessing this way is up, but I'm not exactly sure. Without knowing all that to really speculate what this is actually showing us here. But clearly you see there's not a whole lot of, you see it looks like layers of something more golden, maybe that's more pumice-like, and the more solid, whiter stuff, perhaps lava that's squeezed in there as well, and so some amalgamation of all that material was forming the island. And interesting to note that it actually fell over, right? So that one perhaps not so deeply rooted, the point where it couldn't fall over, or maybe it broke in the middle and the top fell over, or it's hard to tell exactly what happened there. But this is a spot that's formed a peninsula. Let me zoom out a little bit here. There's our double entry. There's our little peninsula on the edge of the levee, and it's formed by this giant tipped over, rotated over block. Really fascinating there. So far we haven't seen a whole lot of this, but the more time passes, you get to see more of this variation in texture, right? So when we look at old photographs and you see some of the textures going in opposite directions, because these things do tilt around quite a bit. And that's something that can give you information, but it can also be deceiving and tricking the eye. Right, so I really like that one. That might be my favorite of the set here today. Matt Patrick. So, and then there's also a series that goes back to this the drone flight that's 10 days ago now. So, flight over Halemaʻumaʻu, we can see here this aerial view. And this really shows what I was talking about earlier with the terracing pretty well, right? We have the active lava surface in here. We have the next step up over here. You see quite a series of benches right in there. And we have another layer that's up here. And we have another layer that goes up to here. And another one that goes up to here. And similarly in the north, you can see there is a current margin. And there is a next shelf up. Next shelf up. And they've actually come together around a backside as recently as last month, but that's stopped, and it seems like that is gone for now. So interesting to think about that and how thick this crust might be. And we really have no idea how deep this island is as well, what kind of root it has. It seems like it must have some draft to it to have moved the way it did in the early stages of the eruption, especially when it was bobbing and rotating and drifting. And it hasn't actually tipped or anything like that, as we see could happen with any of these features, right? Seeing as it just happened with this one down here. So that's the UAS view. Right above, we also have this, which is something I will zoom in on more and pan for you guys. This is where the UAS, the drone, was set to hover above the island and screen a panorama. So this is to the south. as if you were standing on the island. And there is those terraces I was just describing there and there and there. And you see there's some blocks, some rocks that are falling down on these rock slides down the side of the old crater wall and landing on a solid crust, and now they're along for the ride with all the thing rising. Everything's rising as lava is filling below this crust and lifting up slowly but surely. Slowly but surely. We've come up just another meter, but we're up to 224 meters, 735 feet. So we'll pan over from the south. And you can kind of, so now you can see the edge of this terrace there. And perhaps one of the entry points of flow that goes beneath or around the crust under the island, so that it reaches these far edges and is able to push up through the gaps in the crater walls over there. We'll keep panning around to the right. There's the west vent. There's our tipped over islet. There's our middle of the north part islet. And this seems like to be the biggest area of flow visually from the textures, right? There's a big flow direction here and flow direction over there. So we'll just keep watching and seeing what happens. Oh, so I have to correct myself a little bit further over to the right. Here's the islet that's further north, the one that's still further over. And at this point in time, you can still see the little bit of the remains of that perched pond that was up here that drained out right in there. Try to zoom in more. And that might be too much. That's the limit then. So you can see some of the red right in here. And this is what formed a double entry after this whole upper area got crusted over, leaving a cone going this way. And the other one more of a straight shot like that. Although it may, depending on what it looks like underneath that, it might have some little hook to it. You'd imagine all that must get worn away through all the motion of all that mass through there. And by the heat as well, of course. Okay, so panning over. In the foreground, coming in the foreground, some really red oxidized rock. It's forming the peak of this island. This almost looks like a piece of Mars floating here in the middle of Kīlauea. And there's the north edge of that lava lake. Right over here, perhaps. This could be, I'm not sure if this is a photograph, the remains of that north vent that began plastered against the crater wall and then was lifted by the rising tide of lava. Came up, and since that was also the same material as this other island, it seems a little bit lighter, a little bit less dense than that lava that's coming in. Then it was able to stay buoyant and lift it up. It's a little bit of review and a little bit of recap of the photographs issued by USGS-hvo here. There's a couple more. So close up of the main island within Halemaʻumaʻu lava lake. You can see very cracked surface. It reminds me of what Pu'o'o used to look like, for example. Cracked cinder cone that moves in response to the ground all around there. And they do mention that most of the lava fragments are estimated to measure less than 1 foot, 0.3 meters in diameter, and believed to be ejected by small explosions from the lake surface in the early hours of the eruption on December 20th, 21st, 2020. And they do note here, in the background to the right, the top of the North Fissure spatter cone is visible. This was a primary eruptive event for the first week of the eruption. So let me go into that one and get us a better view here of what the remains of the north event looks like. Seems like it's really crumbled a lot. It seemed like this is essentially a horseshoe shape that we've been looking at in the thermal cameras for a while. And it seems like there's been collapse of some of these higher chunks of it. See a lot of rubble right in there as well. Let's see if I can go in more. Right, I managed to use the zoom correctly that time. There it is. Interesting how it looks almost like a painting when it gets through the fume and the heat shimmer, and at that distance, telephoto lens. Yeah, interesting. Look at these views, and we'll once again remind you to compare them to the historical photographs coming up here. All this pile of jumbled rock in there looks like. Okay, back it out here. Okay. All right, a couple more. This is a close-up of one of the smaller islands that began its collapse quite a while ago, but you see the collapse there and exposing that interior core. That's what I'm interested in, is the more that thing crumbles, the more we get a view of its inside. And its inside may be what gives us a clue to what's the middle of that other big island as well. It does look like some really reddish baked. It's hard to tell exactly what is cinder in there and what's lava goop that's plastering it. But that's what you'd be looking at, and perhaps some higher resolution views from the UAS. The geologists are working on exactly that. Okay, that's the kind of eastern crescent over eastern portion. So even though it's considerably smaller, this island still measures approximately 80 meters, 262 feet end to end. The idea of the size of this thing. It is much smaller, but these are all massive features in that lava lake that you gotta, if you need to, go back and look at our size comparisons from weeks ago. Okay, this is a profile view of the northeast side of the main island. So there is all the lava benches you can see in there. You really see that profile, that upper tephra and spatter that was covered by that highest lava bench from early eruption when it was the most under lava. Lava was the frothiest and rising above it the fastest. And since then, as lava has receded, and it's still been rising, but receded relative to this level, it's formed that bench, and then this bench, and then this bench down in here. See quite a lot of, looks like, mineral deposits on here. Perhaps gypsum or something along those lines. Sulfur, another likely candidate. That could be showing that these are primary gas pathways for all the gas trapped under this crust to get out, not just through there, but also up here, higher up on the cone as well. There, long line that way as well.
Does look like gypsum to me. And those pieces.
Yeah.
Hard to say.
Yeah, it's without really seeing it up close. It's really,
right.
I can sit here and guess. But a picture from a drone from a long way away, it's some light color mineral there. Yeah, those are ones that have been culprits in these areas before, right? Like around Ahu'aila'au, still down in Lower Puna, and around Halemaʻumaʻu over the years, and Sulphur Bank, and et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so that is it for this series of photographs. There is one last one that was released just a couple of days ago, March 24 view of the lava lake. So not a whole lot of change, but since we have shown this perspective before, here it is again. You can see here on the left the remains of Greater Rim Drive on that down drop block, and that closed in small area of active lava surface, the double entry relative to the whole crater. There. Okay, so bringing things to
$15 super chat from Brian Beelman. No comment. Appreciate it.
Hello, Brian. Yeah, so coming current now, here's our most recent 24-hour time lapse. You can see that circulation within that area going around that little knob, and you only see it active really on a surface within that little kidney bean shape now. Except for, notably, on this backside, you see this big squeeze up or flow into the gap flow along the crater margin. That is definitely happening as well. There is the S1 camera from the south. Here is the F1 thermal camera from the west, so north more that way. There is that crater rim or crater edge gap flow right there, and our main active lava surface over here. But just to remind you guys, we have seen lava squeezing up all along this entire edge. So really, it's liquid underneath the whole thing. Yeah, even over here on the right. Just kind of wiggles up in different points at different times. That's the F1 camera. So we'll look at our deformation data. If we look here, the USGS, main USGS site, looking at the past 2 days, we just see very small wiggles. This is half a microradian total on the graph, so it's barely, it's going to show us some wiggles, but they're really meaningless in the grand scheme of things. The last week is only showing us 3 microradians. Same kind of deal. It's really hard to tell what's going on there in comparison to before, and the last month is not helpful because this POO line is all whacked out as well. And so if you go through the map, you can get to the actual Wikihuna raw data. Here it is. So here's the last month plot. So relative to all those deflation inflation events that we've been having, you can see us not having them and the size of these wiggles being fairly small relative to that. Right, that's what really matters. So finally got one automatic scale here if you go through the monitoring map and look in the station. Okay, so that's not a whole lot of change in a tilt. That's kept things stable and not a whole lot of changes because of that. And likewise, the GPS is still on its similar tracks as before. It is a longer term signal. We still don't see anything indicative of something shorter term going on. The lava lake is still rising, as I mentioned before, up to 224 meters, 735 feet. It's been much slower, of course. That was expected, and now we don't have the deflation inflation events. We may actually see it pick up a little bit more, although as we've mentioned always, it is broadening up the ice cream cone and has to fill in more of an area to reach the same vertical measure of height. So our update is where this information is coming from. This is USGS HVO's update for today, Friday, March 26, 224 meters, 735 feet deep. SO2 emissions remain elevated at 950 tons per day, last measured March 22nd. Not a whole lot of change there on gas either. We'll come back to that here shortly. But I do want to point out, we just spent a little time talking about the text updates that they put out in our last update there, especially about the East Rift Zone refilling. I want to just track how there's been a little bit of a waffling going on here in the updates in the last few days. So the following day, Wednesday, they do mention here, they've clarified it a little bit. This is actually the original message here. Geodetic monitors indicate that the summit, upper East Rift Zone between the summit and Pu'u'u, have stabilized after contracting by several centimeters in the early days of the ongoing eruption. Refilling of the East Rift Zone continues at rates similar to before the December 2020 eruption. So, and then of course, refilling of the East Rift Zone, we're saying must have implied between a summit and Pu'u'u, of course, right? So, and then that got followed up on the next day, and it clarified exactly that.
We have a $5 super chat from Stephen Leiter. I'm so sorry for butchering your name, probably. You guys are great. I wish someone was doing a fraction of what you were doing, or what you do covering the Iceland eruption.
Yeah, mahalo, Stephen.
Out there.
Yeah, me too. I wish someone was doing
somebody.
It too.
Mahalo.
Mahalo, yeah. So on Thursday, they've revised that to say, here's a Thursday update. Geodetic monitors indicate the summit upper East Rift Zone between the summit and Pu'u'u is refilling at rates similar to those measured over the past 2 years and before the December 2020 eruption. So a little bit more clarity there. Yes, they're talking about between the summit and Pu'u'u specifically, and they're also not talking about necessarily just a build up to 2020 eruption, those few weeks, but more of the longer term trend over the past 2 years. Right, so that was also something that was a little bit ambiguous as well. So that was fantastic. And then you come to today's update, and today's update now says for the East Rift Zone, no unusual activity noted in the region. Geodetic monitors indicate that a proportion of the East Rift Zone between the summit and Pu'u'u contracted while the summit deflated at the onset of this eruption. There is no seismic or deformation data to indicate that any additional magma is currently moving into either of Kīlauea's rift zones. So now we've gone back to what we were saying before the Tuesday last week. So Certainly, it's not clear what's going on. Maybe the changes happening aren't happening very fast. Maybe we're hearing some different voices, right, who are actually writing the update a little bit differently, depending on their perception of it, right? Just like we have a perception of this, everyone does, right? So maybe you're seeing a little bit of that, or it's just not. We'll just keep watching, and it's just a little bit of a thing to track for the extra nerdy volcano guys. All right, SO2 here. SO2 in the last month. Here's our most recent measurement. It's still within that up and down range, and if you didn't catch our update earlier in the week, you can go back and see how this random looking stuff does seem to correspond fairly well to deflation inflation events. So that's why you might see the variation there. And you can go back and listen to that earlier in the week. Just leave it at that here. And VOG is still coming out. The winds are still variable, so there are times when it is blowing southwest, and there are times when it's blowing north. And if I let this animation play long enough, it might show us a little bit of both here. Winds changing, and of course the smell being worse closer to the source, and the actual particles nearer being worse farther from the source. This is a little bit how it works because of the reactions happening as that volcanic gas flies through the atmosphere and meets water vapor, and it has the sunlight to help it react and all that stuff. Okay, we'll switch over to earthquakes, and we will jump over to Maunaloa before we take our intermission and set of questions here, because there's not a whole lot happening in Maunaloa, and there's no sense in spending a whole lot of time, but we're going to cover it, of course, as every time we do. So Maunaloa is actually slowed down in earthquakes, not a lot recently, in either the summit or that northeast Kauai area. Not a whole lot in Kīlauea, and there are a few events here and there, and still most of our events are done in Pahala region. That's really it for the earthquakes there. There's not a whole lot going on. There was, since our last update, a magnitude 3.0 over here, south of Leilani, under the south flank, at a depth of 5.5 kilometers. So 3 miles downish, somewhere in there. So that's normal to have that as an adjustment, long-term adjustment. No big deal going on there. It doesn't mean anything as far as nothing as change in eruptions to the lower rift zone. So no reason for alarm down there. I know there was a little bit of online discussion about that, but in my mind, it's the same thing we've been saying every time. South flank earthquake, nothing to worry about. South flank earthquake, nothing to worry about. So not worth repeating for every time there's a 3.0, because there's going to be a lot of 3.0s over the course of the years here. Okay, focusing on Maunaloa in particular, here's earthquake rates the past month. So we've actually dropped down pretty low, and it's interesting if it drops down to nothing, maybe that's might be worrying, but we still have some going on. You can see the earlier peak of activity, and in the past month you often have day-to-day a lot of variation anyways, so it might be more useful to look going back to the past year. And now we're looking rather at earthquakes per day, earthquakes per week, and we peaked out at around 250. You really can see that it came down, and the one on the right is not really worth. You have to kind of ignore that one every time, because the current month that we're in isn't all the way done. It hasn't had as long a fill up as much as the other ones. So this one on the right is almost always suspect, but you really can see that there's already a stepping down of this earthquake rate that's been going on. And 250 a week is still not enough. Just to remind you guys one more time, it really needs to be up in the hundreds per day before an eruption is expected. And this is 1975 data here. Looking at the tilt's just showing small variations. Nothing here, and you look at the scale is really the same kind of thing as Kīlauea. Even less so, just a daily cycles perhaps. Maybe some other small trend there. Our past month is still blown out by the earthquake that really shook that thing, jolted it. So really there's no changes bigger than the microradian. That's what this is telling us. We're still background flatlined essentially. Our GPS is showing a little more noise. It's not clear if that's because of the data coming in noisy, or because there's a real variation happening or some adjustment happening here. And that could be, right? We discussed earlier why we've had this little drop, or one possible explanation for why we had that little drop as the station measures between that one point north of Mokuaweoweo crater at the summit of Maunaloa and the south point, and we have evidence of intrusion of dikes north of that could have caused both of them to move together and cause a traction. And of course, as the focus of inflation on a volcano shifts to other dikes, so the volcano does all the time, it's putting in dikes of magma here and there and here and there and growing, and that's just what it does. And as that focus shifts over, then perhaps you might see an adjustment of this thing. And we've been watching for that for a while to see whether this rate that you see back here is a rate we see going forward, or whether it's the steeper rate that you see in here that you see going forward. And maybe just squinting at it, it does seem a little bit steeper in this zone right in here, and then a little bit less steep in this zone over here. So that might be all I'm seeing in there. But still curious if we see another adjustment happening up here. In any case, there's no big changes there. This kind of variation is normal. You see variation that kind of scatter in the data other times as well, and it doesn't mean anything alarming, right? For anyone who's wondering that and hasn't been watching our updates for very long, that is not cause for alarm in of itself, and sometimes it does get corrected, and you see it tighten up over time like that. So that is the GPS. That's the most interesting thing there is, and it's just a little bit of a wiggle and not a whole lot of that, just to make sure we're showing you guys where this is all coming from. Most recent Mauna Loa weekly update yesterday. We're still at aviation code yellow and volcano alert advisory, but not erupting. The rates of deformation and seismicity at the summit remain slightly elevated above long-term background levels. Other Mauna Loa monitoring data streams show no significant change in deformation rates or patterns that would indicate increased volcanic hazard at this time. So that's really it. There have been 223 small magnitude earthquakes, 81 below the summit and upper elevation flanks, all less than 2.5, and shallow depths less than about 4 miles, 6 kilometers down. These patterns are typical of the past several weeks. GPS measurements continue to show slow long-term summit inflation, consistent with magma supply to the volcano's shallow storage system. A slight increase in the rate of inflation in the summit that began in January is continuing. Gas concentrations are 0, thermal temperatures are below 100 degrees, both at the summit and sulfur cone on the southwest rift zone. Everything is stable, nothing changing in the webcam, there's just nothing going on there. There is one last thing to say in Mauna Loa, which is that there is a Volcano Watch this week, also written by USGS-hvo, and they are using old aerial photographs and field notes to reconstruct databases of ash in particular. Right, so here's an aerial photograph used by, it looks like, Mr. J.P. Lockwood. You can see over here, you can see what he's done is poke a hole through each location on this map as he visited it by foot, and on the back put a code which corresponds to a log entry in his field notebook. So in that way you can really, before the days of GPS, you can really see what's where, and then create a map on a photograph or base layer like this, based on all this information. So a lot of this predates our modern technology, so it's got to be digitized and converted and input and all of that. This says this was photographed from 1976. So interesting that they discuss all that in here. One sentence I've highlighted to read you guys here. Ash deposits in the flanks of Mauna Loa span ages as young as 380 years before present to older than 31,000 years before present. Ash thickness ranges from about 1 inch, 3 centimeters, to more than 33 feet, 10 meters. However, much more work needs to be done to determine how frequent explosive eruptions are and how many individual explosive events these ash layers represent. So what it comes down to is you have to all those different places, see how many layers of ash you have, and then try to match them between places. And that tells you how many single ash drops you have at one time, and that can tell you how often the ash explosions are happening. So this is all tedious work to get back at the history of the volcano that's embedded in these deposits here, but you have to really do go through this process to extract the information from it. So this is what this Volcano Watch is essentially about, and that's why it's so important, because we'd like to know if there are lots of small explosions or more big explosions that go everywhere, and the balance between those, and map those out and wind directions. Then you can start doing things like Don Swanson's published on, like where must the vent have been, and which direction was it facing, and all that kind of interesting stuff. So fantastic stuff there to think about, and you can get into it by reading about the Volcano Watch, which you can find on hawaiitracker.com, along with some other news here of Kīlauea, including today the lava tube known as Nahuku, or previously Thurston Lava Tube, has reopened in one-way traffic. And you can check that out on there, and some of the other articles that are on there as well. And at this point, Dane, I'll turn it over to you, and you can take us through any other thank yous, mahalos.
Right. Well, yeah, thanks for the super chats, guys. Appreciate those. We do have some donations that came through on hawaiitracker.com. Just a reminder, best way you can support us if you appreciate this type of programming is to like, subscribe, and share. That really does do the most to be able to get this type of information out. Second way to do it is become a member on hawaiitracker.com. That helps. We're building a community there. It's an alternative social media platform to encourage working together a little bit more, trying to base on community. And then third way to help us is monetary donations. We take those on hawaiitracker.com/support. We have had several come through there, and I want to thank them. Susan E., Marion M., Henrietta R., Dave P., Denise J., Elizabeth W., Lisa L., Jessica N., Robert G., SW, Jan R., Julie F., and Barbara R. Appreciate all of you guys. Really good. Appreciate it.
Mahalo, you guys.
Yeah, so let's dive into some questions. We got a good amount here. We're going to have to probably cut some out, but we'll do our best.
I'll try to answer them quick, too.
Yeah. All right. Cecil asks on YouTube, how thick do you think the crust of the lava lake is in some certain spots? Like, just pick a few that you think you could maybe know or guesstimate, ballpark.
Yeah, that's really hard to know. Really hard to know. I mean,
right.
You think that the minimum where it's over the flowing lava, that's it could be a few millimeters, fractions of an inch, eighth of an inch kind of thing, and up to several inches. One of the accounts I was reading from Jaggar, he was describing an old, heavy, thick crust on a lava lake as being 3 or 4 inches thick. Right, so that's kind of the ones that are still moving around on the solid crust. The ones that are all the way frozen in, that's a whole different question, because now we have no idea what kind of process is happening. If there's lava attaching to the bottom of that thing from below and thickening it, perhaps that could throw all bets off, or if it's rather eroding from circulation in certain areas. That's really hard to tell. You would guess it has to be, at least a few feet to maybe 10 feet intuitively, several meters kind of thing. Perhaps might be reasonable to think, but that's just really a wild guess. We really don't know at all what process is dominant under that particular part. So a good question and interesting to think about for sure. And of course, maybe the part, the thing that's the thickest is that island, right? Because it must have a pretty big root. So if you think of the island as being embedded in part of the crust now, then that thing, you can see like the crust has some under the crust topography also in the opposite way, that it goes down further in some areas than others.
Let's talk about that island a little bit. So one of the questions that I saw was, can you explain how an island falls over? I know we talked about this earlier on, a couple weeks ago, but maybe just a refresher on what is an overturning island, one of these islets. Is that what you called it?
Yeah, an islet. Yeah. I don't know if we're going to bring that back in vogue since this was being used 100 years ago or not, but
I mean, since then we replaced it with lava berg. So
yeah. Well, they just come in so many different sizes, right? So you're trying to say something about, well, it is a little floating thing, but it's nothing compared to the size of that big massive one that we've stopped talking about now. just because it stopped moving, but it's still there and bobbing around, right? So it's all about what kind of root that thing has. If it has not that deep a root, or if its root gets severed or melted or eroded away in some way, then suddenly it might be top heavy and just start leaning and pop itself in. And it depends what it is and where it came from. Some of those pieces we think came from collapse of that west vent itself, as it built up and fell over and built up and fell over. When we've seen some of the videos, just chunks of the cone fall in and the lava starts gushing over them, and then it has to push them out of the way, and they end up broken up within a lava lake. So those could be some of the pieces that are the core of some of these little islets, perhaps. And in that case, those ones are not very deep. They're just something that came in from above, right? And then they just get coated in lava over and over and over again. And let's say that lava levels are rising and falling and rising and falling and rising and falling a lot at some point in time, like they have been. Maybe that thing ends up being more elongate up and down than it was broad before. And suddenly it can be top heavy and it tips over. That's one way, for example, that we will discuss here. Something I'm going to talk about when we talk about 100 years ago is you actually have chunks of the crust can get pushed by lava from below, like just swelling the whole ground, and the whole thing can tip and bulge in different shapes as well. And then lava can leak out between them and make it look like they're islands, but they're just crags. Be another term we're gonna start hearing as well.
All right. So Sandra's asking about the island again, but the main island inside the lava lake, and specifically about the parallel cracks that are appearing on it. Would this be from movement of the lava below, or a structural feature of the island components?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the first thing I want to look at is how long have those cracks been there? And the earliest photographs we have, which is true, they're not from the very, very beginning of the eruption, but the earliest ones we have already have big cracks in them at that point in time already, and steam coming through them or other volcanic gases. So, and seeing that, we see cracks when we have slumping, because essentially as the lava level changes around that cinder, it's just a pile of cinder. It'll slump in and fall under its own weight. So over time, most cinder cones start forming those kind of gravity cracks and forming in, right? Are there any happening in Ahu'ailao?
Oh yeah. Yeah, bunch. And also that when it crumbles over and you expose that iron oxide red inner part, that's so common just to me. Like that feels like every time. Which is a natural progression right there.
Right. So, but certainly because it's moving in a lava lake and its level is rising and falling, that's putting pressure in it, and that could certainly be what's causing the cracking, at least initially for it to have done that before it was all the way kind of gooed in, encased by a giant lava bench, right?
All right. We have 2 super chats I want to mention. Michael oh man, I should have Googled this. Jaggar, I'm terrible. I'm sorry.
Mahalo, Michael.
He says, thanks for the updates and analysis. And then we have a $35 super chat from our repeat Gary Bryan. Awesome updates, you guys. And he mentions that I missed the $15 donation or just a minute ago. So I appreciate it, Brian.
Wow.
Gary, appreciate it. Michael. All right. So with that, diving into the next one, little bit easier one here. Hotel Papa asks, what's the methodology to measure the SO2?
Oh, there's some different ways. There's a whole Volcano Watch about that in particular that maybe we can link you. But basically, one way that it's done is by looking with a spectrometer through the gas plume at some infrared source, which is often the glowing lava or the glowing cone, or it depends. Sometimes it was the sun, right? We'd actually drive through underneath a road before there was lava coming out of the ground, and you'd shoot up at the sun, at the cloud. So there's different. That's one way, and you can basically measure the scatter. You need to know the wind speed, and you also measure the distance of dispersion, right, along a profile. Then that way you can get to a whole volume of something per day, let's say. And the wind speed and how much you're measuring it, plus how much is dispersing based on the wind speed and how concentrated it is, makes a difference as well. So it's a lot more high tech than that. That's the basics of it, is and something like that, right? So that's why it makes it very hard if it's raining or foggy to do it.
So we do have one more question here from Witness Me. I'm going to change it just a little bit. In general, if the magma that we were, say there was a gas-rich batch that came up, what could we expect from a shallowing gas-rich amount of magma coming towards the surface? What changes would be expected at the lava lake, just in general?
Yeah, it all depends on how much more gaseous, or that's really the important thing there. And when volcanologists talk about this, it's all about whether the magma and the gas are coupled or decoupled, whether they're moving up together, or whether the gas is like a separate slug of stuff that's separated from the magma and moving by itself. So that's what can cause more of the Strombolian pattern of activity. And so even within our range of variation in Hawaiian magmas, you can still have something that's more or less gassy and have it still be overall not enough to separate the gas from the magma. And it still comes up together, and you just have variations of the Hawaiian style that we have, rather than having something that's more episodic or piston-y, or we do see the pistons from time to time for sure as well. We see deflation inflation events as well. So those could be other manifestations of those same processes. Right, but that's where, as far as I can take you guys.
All right.
I'm trying to understand that, I guess.
All right. We do have a $5 super chat from Stephen Billetier. He asks a question here. Is it still thought that the original island that was formed by a chemical interaction at the beginning of the eruption with the water in the Lost Water Lake?
Yeah, so it's not necessarily just a chemical interaction. There probably is some chemistry muddling things up in there as well, right? But it's essentially you're having that first phase of the eruption. The lava it's like the froth of a champagne, right? Imagining you're popping your champagne bottle, and that first frothy stuff that comes out, like that's the first stuff that you're gonna get. So that stuff, that kind of lava that has a lot of gas in it already, and then being able to quench it and cool it, or essentially that event happened above the lake, pour it in like a giant, many hundreds of dump trucks of stuff into the lake, hot, and vaporize the lake, but you could basically allow it to quench, and then the lava comes and covers over the whole thing. That's some process like that is what happened, right? So there certainly is a lot of chemical interactions happening, but there's also a lot of physical process happening as well at the same time. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So,
all right.
Yeah,
Perfect.
Mahalo, Stephen. Yeah.
All right, I believe that does it for the first level of questions. We will be doing one more round at the end after Philip goes through our 1921 eruption presentation.
All right, yeah, mahalo Dane. Yeah, so we've been researching this for a few days now, and 100 years ago was the last overflow of Halemaʻumaʻu. So what I'm going to do is show you guys here a view of what Halemaʻumaʻu looked like in 1920. This is September of 1920, and the reason I like this photograph is you often do see this inner part of the lake photographed, where you see is little islets and higher islands and larger peaks in the side that they're calling crags, in fact, over here. And you actually can see this is all within, I'm going to pan over to the right here, further and further. This is all within a much bigger crater wall right in there, to the point where you have other separate lava lakes on the side over here. You guys can see that. And zoom out a little bit and across. Show you guys a view in 1920, right? And this is what Kīlauea looked like 100 years ago. And it also hosted a lava lake within Halemaʻumaʻu crater. And yet it was much different than today. So the previous 4 years before that had been an era of many overflows of the lava lake. The lava lake had been flowing over many, many times. I'll show you guys a graph at the end here. But all of that was happening much higher than today's current lava lake. Today's current lava lake is somewhere around 1,200 and 1,300 feet below where this eruption was happening 100 years ago. So we still have a long way to go to fill up to the previous lava levels like we had back in 2018. And that's more or less the lava levels we're discussing when we're showing you guys this activity in here. So Jaggar himself was the one who documented most of this, and he said that March 1921 eruption would long be remembered as the most tremendous fiery display of Kīlauea overflow of this Hawaiian cycle. Never in a past decade had Halemaʻumaʻu presented so brilliant, large, and continuous a sheet of liquid lava overflowing its rim. So that's what we have to come here. I'm kind of setting the scene of what it actually looked like beforehand. And so another way to imagine what was happening here and to bring it back to what our lava lake looks like now and all these different terraces and features and why it might matter. Back in those days, they used different terms. They used a term called epimagma and pyromagma as different kinds of lava that had different textures and appearances and properties, in fact, as well. So let me read you guys what Gordon MacDonald, who was the third director of HVO, describes along with Douglas Hubbard, who was a naturalist at National Park, when it published many years later. He said this: "The upper end of the conduit contained a plug of semi-solid lava, resembling a'a in appearance, and known as epimagma. Fissures extending through this plug allowed liquid lava from below to rise to the surface, where it formed a shallow pool about 50 feet deep, on top of the epimagma. The lava of this pool was termed pyromagma. It was thinly fluid and free-flowing and congealed to form pahoihoi. Both the pyromagma and the epimagma were free to move up or down in the conduit, either independently or together. Owing to its greater fluidity, the pyromagma, the more liquid lava, generally rose or sank more rapidly than the epimagma. Crags of the epimagma projected through the pyromagma as islands in the lake, and at times the lateral shifting of these crags gave the false appearance of islands floating in the lake. The pools of liquid pyromagma continually changed in form, size, and number, with changes in the depth of the pyromagma and the configuration of the top of the semi-solid plug on which it rested." So that's the deal there, and let me advance here and show you guys a map made on March 14th, just before this happened. So this is a view of the Halemaʻumaʻu lava lake, and the white areas are the ones with active lava, and the black areas are showing topographic lines on them here. So before I get into the actual layout of what's going on here, you can see at a glance there's a lot of different lava ponds or lakes. About that shortly, but let's look at down here. He includes a cross section as well, right over here. So what he's saying is there's a semi-solid plug of lava that has cracks in it through which the liquid lava is able to rise and overflow on top of it. But that this whole plug below can also be deformed as magma, essentially the lava is erupting underneath it and bulging it upwards. So it's still magma at that point. It's almost like it's inflating, injecting underneath it before it can crack through the gaps and make it onto the surface. So when this eruption begins, first thing that happens is all this plug starts rising before the lava underneath it can break through it and flood the whole area and drown it all. And that's the sequence we'll take you guys through here. But before I get to that, just to mention, this terminology here, they add back in 1951, the feature that distinguishes a true lava lake from a mere pond of lava accumulated in a depression is a presence in the lake of a distinct circulation of liquid lava from depth into and through the lake and back down into the depths. So by those standards, our lava eruption we have now is a mere pond, quote, rather than a true lava lake. But maybe this is a little bit retrospective since we're still talking about what these different terms for puddles of lava in different shapes happen to be. Yeah, so all that said, we have here in our map from May 14th or March 14th, 1921, our Central Lake, right here in the middle. Central Lake. And we have a West Pond. And we have an East Pond as well. We also have a Southeast Pool. And we have a Southwest Arm. So you can see the terminology is all over the place there. 2 ponds, 1 pool, 1 arm, and 1 lake. They're all just puddles on top of this plug of semi-solid lava they're calling epimagma. That's the gist of it there. So that's kind of the lead up to it. And Jaggar describes what was happening earlier in the month like this. At the beginning of March, the continued subsidence of the lava in the pit made this scene surprisingly impressive owing to the great inner crags towering above the 5 lava lakes. The walls around the several lakes were sheer precipices, 70 feet high in places, and the rim of the pit stood 90 feet above the liquid lava. So that's that first view I showed you guys there, and we can show you guys a little bit of a different view here. At the top, the original panoramic and colorized by Dane here below. I might have to come in a little bit so you guys can see some more of the detail without as much as the breadth here. So there are those crags.
Colorization really helps in there. Makes it look like it's not from the 1920s right away.
Yeah, it really helps to connect it to us, I think, is the important thing, right? Even if it's not exactly true, it's a lot. It's interesting. You can see the colors really evoke a certain kind of connection. And then the details you see also evoke some more science you can do over there. So that's really interesting. Interesting to see them both here side by side. Mahalo, Dane, for all your work on that today. And yeah, that's the view of it there, right? So that 90-foot drop into the lava lake. But as the lava levels start to rise, Jaggar describes something amazing that happens regarding an islet that became an island and then tipped over. And so let me first just point out back on this map, on this map right here, let me get my color so you can see it. Right in the middle, this little black spot right in there, that is the little islet that we're discussing right here. It was just a small little thing, seemingly innocuous, floating in the middle of that central lake. And it became this. And I will read you Jaggar's account of that. An astonishing transformation had taken place in the new islet of the central lake. It had lifted bodily by a swelling upward of the lake bottom around it, to become an immense hill with a flat islet standing like a thin-stemmed wine glass on top. This mass stood 40 feet above the lake. The tilted toadstool on top threatened to fall at any minute. The top of this mushroom tower had been a low flat islet in the lake, which as usual was 30 or 40 feet deep, over an epimagma bottom. The epimagma was arched up suddenly as a function of the sudden rising of the liquid lava that followed. So just preparing you guys to understand what that sentence actually meant there for the last few minutes here, and that's what he's talking about as he's seeing this, right? This was a part of that semi-solid plug of lava, and as that thing bulged from below, the island attached to it was tipped over within the lava lake. So this was a sign, and most notably, because this thing rose faster than the lava level was rising. Right? So let me continue his description here. The lower portion looked like an elephant, rounded and black with a smooth surface. The whole mass had lifted faster than the lake and had filled a great part of the lake area. The hourglass effect on top was where the stem of the islet had narrowed just below lake level. And then below that, evidently the topography of the bottom had widened out. The whole mass was toppled over toward the west. And imagine the view. He was talking about this little islet rising out of the lava lake for long, long afterwards. In fact, this event, this thing rising out of here, was one of his key observations to how the whole process on Kīlauea Summit and its lava lakes actually worked. So it was a really impactful eruption on Jaggar for various reasons. This is all in a build-up still. So on the early hours of March 18th, 1921, the There was a bright glow coming from the crater. Earthquakes ticked up. Harmonic tremor started showing on the early instruments. And Jaggar made his way back to Halemaʻumaʻu. And he describes what he sees when he arrives there. Was this? As follows. He summarizes the whole activity by saying, An intense effervescence following the previous rise of the crags made Halemaʻumaʻu overflow and renewed the big flows at the rift vents on Kīlauea floor. Though much more sudden, this eruption was not unlike the December and February risings. So what you guys are seeing here is a fountain, individual jets 40 feet high, rising through the surface of this rising lava lake and piling up spatter deposits on the side over here. On March 19th, this is the following day, but there's not a whole lot of photographs. This is one I have to show you guys of that phase of it. He describes the activity renewing as such. At 12:30 a.m., just after midnight of the 17th, there was a quick breakup of crusts and rising of the lakes, which increased the brilliancy of the pit remarkably during an hour. By 2 a.m., the fountains were in view from the volcano house. At 5 a.m., the fountaining of the west, central, east, and southeast pools was in plain view from the observatory, and a brilliant glow was seen beyond in the southwest region. At 6 a.m., the pit was overflowing its northeast lip. At 6:45 a.m., the rider reached Halemaʻumaʻu. And he's booking it all the way there, and he finally gets there. 6 a.m. and he sees a whole different view. I'll show you guys this view first. From the rim of the pit at the south pressure ridge, the most sensational change was found to have taken place. In contrast to the dull crusted lava of the previous evening 40 feet down, the lakes were now 4 feet below the east margin of the pit, all merged into a small sea of fountaining lava with the crags standing high as islands, and the liquid was brimming over the southwestern and northern sides. Southwest Lake, South Channel, and Southeast Pool had numerous large fountains and ballooning skins. The southwest island was submerged, and the south table crag was tilted westward, its southern cliff only 6 feet high. The liquid was rising rapidly. Here is the original view, all these photographs by Jaggar himself. And here, colorized view, that now higher lava surface right in there. And you see the tops of those crags looking like little islands floating, but really, when lava levels were lower, these were big structures rising from below the lava, like part of that semi-solid plug. Interesting views there. 100 years ago. The several pools of lava of Halemaʻumaʻu were marked only by fountaining areas, with fountains not so numerous as in December, but with more large centers of effervescence separated by surfaces as skin. All the crags were islands. The hollows north and northeast of Halemaʻumaʻu had filled evenly with an extension of the lake, backed by a new rampart of slabby crusts. Interesting, slabby crust, we saw that today already in photographs. And this, during the high level, greatly enlarged the actual lake surface beyond the limits of the pit. So, showed you guys. I can get it back here.
Did we have in that the map view, the top down? Did it give dimensions of the lake? Like
this whole thing, end to end, is probably 1,200 feet or so.
Okay.
So maybe a quarter mile ish, somewhere in there. A little less. So there's a lot of small stuff and a lot of stuff happening in a fairly small area compared to what we have happening today. A lot smaller than today. All right. So here's a view. This is the March 14th map, and all the pools are clearly separate bodies here, and you see all these peaks and all this topography shown in here. And I'll jump forward for you guys to the one from April 4th. So by this point in time, the lava was already receding, but this gives you a much better idea of what it was actually like. during that high flood on March 18th. You see here, most of it's all connected. And earlier, lava was filling this gap as well, all through here, and overtopping this part as well. And filling all through here on this backside, all the way to here. All this was all filled in, all the way to the edge, and to the shelves up in here. And that was all liquid lava. That was the extent of it there. So here's how he describes that, and I'll leave this map up so you guys can try to imagine. Right? Streaming in the east pond area was southward, directly away from the skin, which separated this current from the pool. Like that. Where the streaming was northeastward. Large fountains were increasingly clustering in the southeast pool region. So this thing's spilling over this way, it's spilling over this way. And there's, in this area over here, more fountaining beginning. The castle crag had changed shape. This one over here. The north peak of the northeast crag mass had slumped. Nothing was left of the new island in the central lake. The whole thing that fell over is totally reabsorbed or redeposited. Very large fountains had started a cauldron of gas release and depressed lava in what had been the east corner of the southeast pool. Towards this focus, there were inrushing currents from the east pond, south channel, and central lake. The action increased until the stormy center of activity was the most conspicuous feature of the eruption, with the inflow from the other pools becoming frequently cascades into the vortex at the cauldron. The immense fountains built a black glacier rampart grotto and flung up clouds of droplets and filaments that formed deep cindery beds to leeward, southwest of Halemaʻumaʻu. It does also notice that those glassy ramparts are full of up to quarter-inch size olivine crystals, and it's something that we'll come back to later on. This was a flow famous for its olivine content. The southeast cauldron and its ramparts had assumed the character as a sinkhole, with a line of enormous fountains across the southeast pool in a southwest-northeast direction, flinging showers of spray 80 or 90 feet away. The lowest level of the foaming pool stood about where the east cove of the southeast pool had been, and directly under the southeast station, where the ground had been flat, much frequented by visitors. The fountains made a swishing sound like the surf and had the quality of the Maunaloa fountains, only the lava was much more viscous. Every now and then, spurts of brown fume violently blown up from below rose through the storm of fountaining. Individual fountains were of the perpetual type, with flings 15 to 20 feet high, but as much of the time the cauldron was a roaring abyss of hundreds of fountains, indistinguishable as units. The violent fountaining was concentrated at the West Crag Grotto and the cauldrons, with green and salmon fume rising and the intensity changing from time to time. The southern part of Kīlauea crater was aglow with brilliant meandering streams and the unchanging mottled dome of glowing melt, welling up in artesian fashion at the rift. There was a lot going on there. A lot of different activity here. And this is Jaggar's night view, not the best image, but there's not a whole lot of them. Night view of the south cauldron of the March eruption of Halemaʻumaʻu. Here's a spatter rampart in the foreground, on the edge. And this is the pit that all the lava is draining into. You can't quite make it out. There's a lava falls pouring there, a lava fall pouring in there, and then one from this backside also pouring into that hole right there. So Jaggar's words again. Kīlauea was never more spectacular. At Halemaʻumaʻu, the gas release which followed the overflowing produced 3 sinkhole cauldrons inside the pit, arms of the lake. These developed enormous clusters of roaring fountains, hot greenish-brown fume, inrushing cascades, and upthrown slaggy flings that formed ramparts. Showers of grit and spun glass fell to leeward. The new rim of Halemaʻumaʻu was almost unrecognizable. The eruption continued steadfastly, with pit and adjustment to overflow, and the crag islands, which had risen less than liquid, began to disappear. So that's another view there. I'll show you guys a map. And this is our Google Earth of our current caldera, our current collapse pit, our current Halemaʻumaʻu pit. It's about like that. The previous Halemaʻumaʻu pit was in the area of here, and as I mentioned, it was much smaller. The overflows escaped from the rim of the pit on 3 different sides. The overflow northeast swept down for a mile in a volcano house direction, crossed the trail, and made a'a lava at its front. This flow also consumed the nearby tool hut. Its contents were water barrels, crowbars, shovels, hammers, and some pipes, lumber, and furniture belonging to the observatory. A little bit more zoomed in here. The longest flow was pouring all over the southern end of Kīlauea caldera and out through a gap in a wall, where it advanced 1/3 of a mile into the desert and stopped. The inner caldera had been breached at an elevation of 3,625 feet above sea level. That's right here. Lava flow was aided by a cone 500 feet southwest of the lake, somewhere around here, known as the Red Sotafara, which also connected to the lava column and erupted with the rising lava. So to clarify, zoomed in here, the lava lake was over here, and it was overflowing every direction. And there was also a small little cone off to the side that was connected through a crack or something to the lava lake. And when the lava rose through the lava lake, it also rose through that crack and poured out the side over here. And together, the overflow of the lava lake and of the lava coming out of the Red Sotafara both fed this gigantic flow that piled against this cliff here at the back wall, south wall of the caldera. It piled higher and higher and higher and higher and higher until it finally got through this little gap and flowed out the gap about 1/3 of a mile over here. And so I call this the inner caldera because there's another cliff back here. That's what we call it the Great Caldera. The outer caldera is the true edge, and you can see that this other cliff has also kept in part of this flow in 1921. And in later times, let me advance here and show you guys that geologic map. 1921 is this yellowish unit. And this area down in here has since been covered by 1971 and 1982 lava, right? And all of it piling against this cliff edge of the caldera wall over there. So, the Red Sotafara. Here it is, in December 28th, 1920, before this big overflow and uprising, and some people. I like this image because it's got the people for scale. Right over here, here is our vent. You can see quite a lot of fume. And what you can't tell is a lot of this light-colored stuff is a lot of that gypsum and quartz and other opal deposits from persistent degassing and probably some interaction with steam and water in this area as well. Right through here. And so he describes bright orange, yellow sulfur, and selenium in the foreground. And some recent overflows also come around that cone as well, over here. Right, so that's the before. And Jaggar afterwards went and took this one. So this is the black and white, just so you can kind of compare this little knob right here, that little knob right there. So here, this is the lava dome. Standing lava dome which formed at that outlet of that vent, right? And once again, back people for size, lava dome, and finally I'll show it to you guys as Dane colorized it. Jaggar describes what it took to get this photograph, right? Here's what he says. For photographic purposes, the standing fountain was approached within 25 feet. The liquid incandescent dome stood 9 feet above the ground level and surmounted an open pot 20 feet wide towards the southeast, where the gush of heavy fluid boiled over in a long curve with standing waves and fed a steadily running torrent. I was able, from a monument which stands a few hundred feet southwest, to walk rapidly to the bank of the torrent over hot shells and take a photograph. So he's describing his adventure there scientifically of walking across shelly, hot pahoehoe lava that was still cooling to get to the edge of the actual active channel here and take his photograph. So, mahalo for the effort back 100 years ago, Mr. Dr. Jaggar.
That's been pretty nuts. I know what it was like walking on Shelf Ahoy after the 2018 eruption off on the sides of the lava river, and it was nothing friendly, and it wasn't active at that point.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It was another level with these guys, right? You know, he before this whole sequence begins, he finds ways to crawl down into the pit and walk around on the different ledges and look at stuff close up. And, you know, a few months later, the whole thing gets flooded with lava and everything just vanishes, you know. Not only places where he used to climb down to the very bottom part, but where he was taking tourists a little bit higher up than that. All of it flooded by the whole surge, right? So it was really a whole different thing. We're going to climb down into the pit as close as possible with rope ladders or whatever it takes. Yeah.
The cowboy times.
Yeah, different era. Yeah, for sure. So now I'll show you guys a photograph of an area known as the Italian Cliff. It's over here. And this is the south part of Kīlauea. This is that smaller inner caldera wall that you see. And what you're seeing is this lighter color stuff is the active lava flow that's pouring out and piling against this wall. Right? So they note that this is a locality of algae. Right? So that also indicates steam or fresh water. And, you know, now after 2018 and this collapse, we do know that there is perched water and some impounded dikes in the southwest rift zone area exactly right around here. In fact, we might have draining of water from this exact zone. So at other points in the past, this was all covered in lava and it was steam vents and it grew algae. And not just algae, but some rare ferns as well. So Jaggar describes this photograph here. The smoking place on the cliff is where the fresh overflows are filling the whole south end of the greater crater and spreading to the south bay so as to destroy the blue-green algae and the solfataric deposits which characterize this ash section known as the Italian Cliff. Also, it was here that the rare primitive fern Ophioglossum had been found. So the natural primitive fern was found in the area, but it was all destroyed by this eruption. Fortunately, it was found again years later, not far from here, some different cracks. Right, but that's a whole other story. We'll leave the botany for those more qualified than that. And show you guys another panorama here. So this is now March 21st, at which point in time the lava has started to drain a little bit. That's centered here. And read you guys Jaggar's account once again. There was a slight lowering of the lava lake, and it had become a Niagara of complicated lava falls pouring into the northern and eastern cauldrons. As the greater cascades were from 50 to 100 feet wide, and the fall fully 40 feet, something of the grandeur of this fiery maelstrom can be imagined. The whole pit was resolved into 3 parts: quiet source pools southwest and west, rapid torrents center and southeast, giant cascades and churning cauldrons north and east. And there's another phenomenon that he describes, which you don't have images for, so I'll leave you guys looking at this. Here, I'll zoom it in a little more. You guys can imagine what's happening over top of this lava lake.
You're an artist. Open Microsoft Paint.
That's I can draw it on there on top of that, right, with my little on-screen jar. But this activity was accompanied by whirlwinds generated by uprush of hot gas, and deposits of glass droplets, olivine crystals, and spun glass were piled up near the ramparts. The actual whirling movements carried shells and fragments of glowing basalt hundreds of feet into the air, becoming miniature tornadoes, and lifted the fountains and burning gases into streamers of fire. These whirls made loud roaring noise, and the larger fragments fell several hundred yards from the pit. The calm, cloudy weather caused the finer stuff to rise to great heights and fall as grit and wisps of Pele's hair many, many miles away. There you go, Dane. Another early lava-nado account.
There you go.
Count number one of that sequence. He's got another one, actually.
Oh, yeah.
But I mean, the first one, the whirlwind developed a basal breadth of 800 feet, migrating across the east rim of Halemaʻumaʻu. The moment it acquired the loose grit available on the older lava surfaces, it became black with debris, which it whirled around for a few moments and then expended itself and disappeared. Another strong whirlwind started in the south cauldron and migrated back and forth over the hot rapids inside the pit. There you go, Dane.
There you go. Pretty intense stuff.
Fragments were carried up to 700 feet. The lava was drawn up into what appeared to be streamers of red flame. Whenever the spout migrated over a crag or the brink of the pit, it became blackened with lava particles. After action for 20 minutes with loud roaring noise, this world expended itself. Larger fragments seen close at hand as they struck the ground were red hot and pasty. One of these on the west side of the pit was 52 inches long and 20 inches great its width. It must have weighed over 40 pounds. Many fragments weighed 5 or 6 pounds and consisted of shreddy coarse lava, folded and twisted. There were stringy pieces of cigar shape. Others were irregular, including many light lava shells. A tendency to elongate form, twisted once in a figure 8, was common. The substance came from papery crusts and from flings of the central fountains. Much scoriaceous glassy lava was blown about, which gave rise to false reports of an explosive eruption. Hot whirlwinds are common here, but these were unusually large. So interesting there, that little note at the end, that even then, false reports of explosive eruption, there was not even any social media going on, but people see stuff falling from the sky. It must have exploded, it must have exploded. And word spreads and coconut wireless.
That's nothing new.
So at the end of the month, started a rapid sinking away of the lava column to the 100-foot level. This was a closing stage of the eruptive crisis, and the fire pit resumed its more normal condition, with scores of fountains, numerous islands and crags, lava cascades pouring into wells, and shifting surface currents across the incandescent lake. That's their normal back then, right? 4 years of high lava level activity. The crags and lake lowered 10 feet or more per day. Whirlpool and shifting sinkholes formed. The crags and islets increasingly emerged. Fume grew thicker, and lines of traveling fountains became conspicuous features. The noise, glow, and heat greatly diminished. The flow on Kīlauea floor ceased when the subsidence began, and the impressive underground chambers were revealed at the 2 source cones, with wells surrounded by glowing stalactites and banners of pale flame. So we'll return to the red Soltafara here, colored once again by Dane. And here it is glowing out of its pit after the fact. And as the lava drains away, this is many months later, you see there's been a rearrangement of exactly where the crags are the highest, and how the ponds all connect, and the whole layout of the whole thing actually becomes altered quite a bit. I'm going to zoom in on it a little bit more here. All right, so that's the account of that. What was in the end about a 1-week event, right? And they called it an eruption, but it's really an overflowing event because there was lava at the surface before that erupting, quote unquote, but they thought that didn't count. In those days, it could be picky enough and said that doesn't count. And when it surged up through that was an eruption. So that's what this event has been described as an eruption in those terms. As a surge through that and above that background level. And going back to background level meant there was still lava on the volcano, although it wasn't to overflow that rim ever since then. So let's look at the geologic map here today, and we'll start with this pre-collapse geologic map. Just to show you guys, there is 1921 lava here on this map down over here on the south part, and also there's a bit of it showing the northeast and a bit of it showing here to the northwest. Yeah, some of this was covered in 71 and 74 by these flows in this area over here. So that was actually continuous this way, all within the pit, and of course all this was blown out by the explosion in 24. And the northeast branch that went towards Volcano House is still over here. And that's before the collapse, which is to say that this flow has been accessible and people have been able to do more modern science in the times since then. There was science done back then as well. We'll come back around to that. But to start off here, there have been samples collected of this 21 flow. And let me move here to our current geologic map and collapse. So that 1921 flow, there's a part of it underneath a road on that downdrop block right over here. There's a piece of it on this western block over there. There's a piece of it over here on this 900-meter elevation downdrop block right in there. And there's a piece on an upper downdrop block, the largest one, that now is truncated by this cliff. And north of there, no more. So now it's fully within this inner pit, and the 1921 flow is not visible on this upper caldera floor any longer. So studies can still continue, but you see that it's a lot less accessible than it was before the collapse, even though there are still chunks of it up there. Of course, I'm not showing you guys off the bottom of this map. There is more some up here, up on the rim. This map is not showing it, but in an earlier geologic map, I showed you guys where that arm reached to the south towards the inner caldera wall, right in there. So what have we learned from taking these samples? This is a paper, 2019, by Petruska et al. And we've shown this before. And he's comparing on this panel on the right over here what was a typical pattern or the actual magma bodies and their interactions coming up to the surface between the years of 1912 and 1954. Right? So it's can't quite see all of it there, but I can read you guys what the numbers actually mean, right? So number 1 was 1912. Number 2 was 1917 to 21. So that's us coming through here. 17 to 21, right? We kind of got the tail end of that. We'll talk about that tail end shortly as well. But then the next post that came up was number 3. Came up separately, not through there, in 1923. And they kind of contaminated each other, and that's how they reconstructed this kind of pattern. And number 4 was the collapse and explosion in 1924. And then you have number 5 coming in 1929, 31, 32, and 34. It was refilling eruptions, refilling of that pit. And finally, number 6 and 7 is 1952 and 54. 2 branches of something that had gone through some earlier lava. Or the idea being that you basically had pulses of different batches of lava coming up, magma coming up, and not one continuous connected system. And to the left here is his comparison of the connected system we've had recently and likely still have again now. The connection all the way to Pu'o'o and East Rift Zone. And that pathway was worn open, we believe, by those 35 years of eruption. An upper pathway to a shallower chamber and a shallow eruption at the summit area here. So we may have more of this configuration, right? But it doesn't mean we can't have some version of both at the same time, right? Or if we could have this going on and still have a separate batch that might come up. It may not exactly connect all the way through to this eruption site, right? That's one possibility of the signals that are showing in a volcano. Or it could be that it's coming up and there's some kind of epimagma per se, some plug of some kind, or something that's separating it, or buffering it, and blocking it. And I really don't know. And that's something that we have heard HVO write about and Volcano Watch us about. Maybe that could be something infrasound could help you figure out pathways of magma and shapes and those kind of things. Not just infrasound, but the seismic and different kinds of seismic, ambient seismic signals and etc. Those kind of things. Right, so that's the patch of it right there, right? So in the end, we have these pulses that came through, and so there's more done. And let's step forward here and show you guys a combination figure here. So these are from USGS professional paper 1806. And on the left here, we've just recolored it to make it the same as the right. This is originally from 2 different plots. Right? But what we're showing here on the left is the magma filling rate, cubic kilometers per year, and on the bottom is intervals of time. So it starts off at 1823 to 25. Over here is 1840, after which the rate of filling drops down significantly. So really from 1840 all the way through 1918, with some error in this variation, you have a much lower level of lava supply, right? So this is where this argument comes in of, well, we have a much less connected system. It's not just flowing through all the time, it's coming up in batches instead because it's less connected. Okay, so that's up to 1918. And over here to the right is following 1918. So you can kind of see that following that, and this is around 1952 or so right in here. It's kind of low, and then it picks up again, and more recently, the more recent era has shown supply rate way up here. So we're at a much higher time where that puts us in a very different realm to what was happening 100 years ago, right, as far as supply rate goes, which is important for what you see at the surface. But still, you can see that, putting in context, 1921 was really in the middle of that low spot, right? So it's really thought that there could be just different batches coming up, and they might have been more gassy, and maybe that's why they were more olivine rich. You know, olivine crystals take time to grow; they grow pretty slow in the magma chamber as well. Not always. There's been more recent research on that, but you know, the bigger they are, usually the longer they have to be at that optimal conditions to grow. So to have bigger ones, you'd imagine that lava, and for the lava to be reported to have been viscous as well. Jaggar called it more viscous. Maybe it was a separate batch, or like the dregs, like that last batch, right? In fact, there were pulses in January, December, February, and March. And he speculates somewhere in his writings that there are essentially 3 pulses of the last big slugs of gas, perhaps, that were a little bit more separated coming to the surface and causing this 3 pulses, which we'll show you guys shortly as well in the signals. So that's the magma supply right there, and we're almost done here. But here is the plot, looking from 1912 on the left to 1926 on the right. So our 1921 period is right in here. On the bottom is a tilt, so there's some variation in tilt. You see there's a lot of gaps. You see there's some regional uplift happening outside, and then you see the smaller signals on top. In the middle here is a lava lake level. That's what the red plot shows. And on the top is earthquakes. So there are not a whole lot of earthquakes, really, as far as notable swarms connected to this event. There was adjustments of Maunaloa in particular, it seems like, but also Kīlauea, to the lack of pressure. But we have to basically zoom in to this little bump right in here. But you really see that for 4 years, the lava level was by the rim, by this red line up here. And before that, it had been visible, but lower, right? At elevation of, in this case, 3,100 feet or so. Right? So we today are still down way over here. This is where our lava level is compared on that graph, more or less. Okay, so we're going to zoom in. First, we'll zoom in. There's a version of this that goes a little bit less time. So 1919 on the left, 1921 is right here in the middle. That's this hump right in here. And we did follow the Maunaloa eruption and draining, all that event. That was the last time that we had high lava overflowing the crater. So from that time, mid-1920, when eruption ended, right around here, it was a long eruption, recovering, and then we come up in 1 pulse, 2 pulses, 3 pulses right there, and go back down, and maybe another pulse, but it doesn't make it to the actual lip of the crater. And this over here is 1924, when the whole thing blasts out, and nothing's ever the same in Halemaʻumaʻu again from that point forward. So, okay. You can zoom way in. I've drawn, this is the first image I showed you guys on the bottom right here. That's where the black line shows where it goes. Second image I showed you guys just right here. And zoomed in and stretched it out to show you guys in a little more detail what was going on here. Okay, so, because we're interested in something like the tilt, right? How much tilt variation was it? Well, this is showing it in seconds and not microradians, so there's another factor of 5 something that is applied here, right? So, but you can see that in mid-May there is a rise in the tilt And there's lots of these rises, so you can see that these probably did correspond to the changes in lava level to some degree. If you look a little higher up here, lava level, highest at the surface there, almost reaching the rim, right in there, which is an idea that's not new to us, since we've discussed in the past the publication of Matt Patrick et al. Of using the 2018 lava lake as a piezometer, as a pressure gauge for the whole lava system and went all the way to pool. So there was a little bit of tilt signal, but they weren't that good. I mean, this was early days of the signals. They were looking at lava level, and this was mostly documented by what you guys saw. Jaggar walking around on foot, taking his camera and notebook around. So that is a 1921 eruption, and we will take questions and wrap it up here.
Quite a big event, huh?
It was really something. Yeah.
Seems like it left an impression on Jaggar, that one.
Yeah, and you got to remember, of course, that it never overflowed the lip that ever again. There were other eruptions on the caldera floor from other fissures that, in fact, put lava near those same areas, but it never bubbled over the pot that way ever again. There were eruptions later in Jaggar's life, right? There was the whole refilling sequence, 9 eruptions between 24 and 34, but they're all at most a month long, and he was like, well, that's nothing, that doesn't count. That's just a puddle. That's just a pond, right? It's unless there's circulation up and down, maybe it's not actually a real lava lake.
Right. Yeah, that was kind of the thing, just the pond and the lava lake, the distinction between them. Because we'd be more into a pond situation currently than a lava lake, maybe per se. But we've been calling it lava lake for so long now that I don't think we're going to stop.
Yeah, I mean, at one point it was the largest open lava surface in the world. So you have to, at that point, what else do you call it except the lava? You know what I mean? So the actual active surface has contracted quite a bit. But yeah, it's I think in those days they were really lava lake snobs. And then imagine his depression, as from 1934 to 1952, there's no action on the volcano. It's the longest quiescent period, and 18 years go by, and they have to keep thinking back about what happened in this era, which is why he thought finally of this eruption as well.
Right. We do have some questions about Jaggar himself, kind of who was he in general, and when did he come, and why did he come to Hawaii? Just in general.
Yeah. So in general, Jaggar was a pioneering volcanologist, is what I'll call him. And he was a geology professor. He had studied at Harvard and was teaching at MIT as well. And he had been to see the eruption of Mount Pele in Martinique, which is one that had massive devastation, wiped out villages with people in them. Right. So a lot of casualties. I want to say something like 20,000. It was tragic. And he went there after the fact, as was the manner in those days. Volcanologists went to volcanoes after they erupted to try to figure out what had happened and recreate it. And so he took the idea of he just took that and flipped it on his head and became more forward thinking. There were other guys doing this already. There was Frank Perret and Vesuvius, who was then recruited to work with Jaggar. But they wanted to actually monitor the volcano and correlate the changes they saw on the surface in real time to active processes to then predict what might happen to move people to safety. And one of his models was in fact, never shall the cities burn again, because that was what he really wanted to protect was people, and that's why he was doing this. So it all came from that. And so he was an innovator, he was a pioneer. He was many times the only staff member of HVO. Other times he was able to expand the staff. Other times he had to shrink the staff again. He was its founder and its longest director. He did have a lot of financial help from other important players in Hawaiian history.
Right.
But that is basically Thomas Jaggar. And then he lived out his life here in Hawaii after he came here in 1912, founded observatory in 1912.
Awesome. So we do have some questions. There was one Marin Purvis asked, or a moderator, and I saw another question about it too. You mentioned in one of the figures, I believe, or one of the images, about the greenish brown fumes coming up.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I put those in there because I saw a lot more descriptions of color of fume and gas than I'm used to seeing, or that I'm able to see, perhaps. I don't know. And I don't know exactly what those might be. There are some more recent papers on degassing and different sulfur and chlorine components that might be involved. I don't know. I'm just throwing it out there, but I'd have to look into it more. I have no idea. I have no idea what those could be. But you hear about salmon fumes, brown fumes, blue fumes. We know blue fumes, right? Brown, maybe there's some piece of the crag down that semi-solid plug is getting entrained in a lava fountain, and it gets shot up and it comes out as a puff of ash or more solid material. I don't know. I mean, there's all kinds of crazy things which is why I share the story, is to open our imagination to what kind of things could happen in the future, right?
It's always different too, because like when you said a salmon colored plume, I'm thinking of like Pu'u'o collapsing after the eruption and putting up those pink clouds type of thing, and
exactly,
and stuff like along those lines. But yeah, really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so it's a shame, so we do the best we can with those colorizations, right? There's never going to be the same as these guys' descriptions, and that's why we rely on it, right? They essentially was writing daily updates, just like we are today. Daily updates during eruption, and when it quieted down, he went back to weekly, and when it quieted down, he went back to monthly, and just
back in the old days, one of the things I noticed just in history is they have a lot more observational ability to relate it in vernacular, just to describe what they're seeing. Whereas I think we've gotten too reliant on, what are you looking at? Here, take a look, click. Here, I just sent it to you. Like that just kind of diminishes over time the ability to really go in depth with that kind of nuanced writing at scale, at least. I'm sure there's some guys out there that's like, I'm going to keep doing it, but like at scale, no.
Right. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I mean, I like to think that we try to incorporate a little bit of that in our news style, right? Obviously, we do a lot with the video. Video is the way of the future, of course, but we're describing what's happening day to day, and that same tradition, right? And in more detail, perhaps, than the regular text updates USGS is putting out nowadays, right? That are informative and factual, of course, but for many people, that's not enough, and they want to see more of what's going on, and they want more description and more observation. And there is data; it's just all photographic and video, and doesn't come with a running commentary.
I'll tell you this one thing. After all this Iceland, the hype that's been going on with that eruption and the live streams going on there, I don't think USGS is going to get away with not doing another live stream next time something happens, and like real live stream, because I think the internet's become a little hooked on it after 2018 with Fisher 17 and the Civil Beat one, and this live stream.
Yeah,
something about it that don't think it's going to be easy to go.
Yeah, I think they should. I mean, who knows how long this will last? And some of these changes that Jaggar is describing are happening over the fact of minutes. So if we're as a public watching a view that's once every 15 minutes, we're gonna miss 500 things in between those shots, right? Whereas we could actually see them in real time, would be really amazing. But of course, that's that's a lot harder now that there is not a physical office there. So hopefully they're, I know that they certainly value time lapses, have been deploying those cameras everywhere, as ever since Timor pioneered it. So that's been awesome, and I'm sure that if they can get one out there, that they will. And I'm sure that they are also watching Iceland, right? Because guys who are working there are also volcano nerds, right? So it's interesting to see, what the differences are, right? And and hopefully our first responders and our responding governments are also watching, what's going on over there, and get some ideas.
All right. So next one is about 1921, the West Vent. Does it have any? It doesn't appear to have any logical connection to the current vent when you're showing that it coming up from depth. So is it just a coincidence or a historical channel that it's in the similar place? This is a question from Stephen.
It's an area that's in the Southwest Rift, which has a lot of cracks, just like the East Rift Zone. A lot of cracks in the Southwest Rift Zone. So there's an area where that rift zone essentially intersects that magma column, and that's that junction right in there. Of course, depending on the shape of it, of the surface there, it can move and change, right? But essentially you have cracks that run to the southwest like a spoke of that crater. And it's one of these cracks that was already there that when lava rose up, it just rose through the crack and went out the side at the same time. And it's almost like it was like a watering can, right? It has like a central shaft, and then it has a little nozzle off to the side, and you fill it up, it just fills up both together, and it comes out the top and it comes out the one at the side at the same time. It was basically like that. They were 500 feet away, not that far. And in fact, that whole area is now all collapsed, so it was all part of the same system.
Right. Let's just do one more question to end it up on.
Perfect.
Take it a little larger scale. Stephen asks, what is the long-term prognosis for Kilauea? Will the whole caldera eventually overflow, leading to an increase in elevation of the volcano summit?
Well, I think the long-term prognosis is the magma getting to the surface, whether it's in a single continuous eruption, whether it's in shorter eruptions or multiple eruptions. That's where the detail lies that we don't know. It won't escape the caldera likely unless it cracks open along that seam, which still exists. For example, it could crack up on that seam on a caldera rim, and then it can flow away from the caldera through the desert, for example. Won't affect any people that direction. But that's the only way to get out of the caldera sooner without filling in all that massive space which exists within a pit. And so it should fill more and more and more and more. What's interesting to me, and maybe I'll end it on this, is if some future eruption ends up coming up through the bottom of our cooled lava lake, right, whose interior is said to be this semi-solid plug of lava kind of thing, we could essentially be forming with our lava lake now the beginnings of a future semi-solid plug of lava. That any lava pressure comes up below and through and around, and we might have in the future multiple perched lakes on a surface that we see now. And so that's why I'm interested to see where the valleys are and where the hills are and what the features are here and there, because that surface may one day host multiple lava ponds that crack through its surface, or if it gets tilted this way or that way, right? That topography is going to matter someday for that reason. Until it disappears and it won't matter anymore, and then we'll talk about what happens then at that time, right? That's the beauty of this story. It never ends. It just goes on and on and on, changing perpetually, right? So that's you know, the most tantalizing thing, right? Might we get back to some era where we have 5 different lava lakes and crags that rise between them that are not actually islands, but the actual lake bottom deforming and rising through and poking through, and then they tip over and tilt sideways, and things rise this way and sink over there, and there's giant fountains and cascades that can be 40 feet high, all from one pit to the other, all inside the same thing.
Yeah, that'd be pretty nuts. Like
that could, you know, how do you get there from a collapsed caldera in 2018? Well, maybe this is the first step towards that. You put a bunch of lava that can start cooling and congealing and degassing and form a semi-solid plug, and later on you erupt through it and start doing that whole other thing, right? At some point you need to narrow the crater as well, because you just can't sustain that wide area. So that's why you can now be doing interesting things with that feature in there. So
very interesting. We appreciate the rundown and the dive back through history, and we will be making a stream highlight of that presentation. Yeah, and a stream highlight of the stuff that Philip threw into the lava lake with Photoshop last week. So we'll be getting those out over the weekend.
Mahalo, guys. Thanks for all your questions. Thanks for your comments. Thanks for your support. Mahalo, Dane, for all your work online on the streams and the chats. And on behalf of Danny Pond, for Hawaii Tracker, I'm Philip Ong.